The ultimatum didn't come with a warning. Ilara had walked into her grandfather's study expecting the usual, a dry review of quarterly figures, perhaps a lecture on the Whitmore family's legacy, the kind of speech Edward delivered with the precision of a man who had rehearsed it since before she was born. She had worn her best blazer for it. Cream, structured, the kind that made her feel like she had armor on. She had not expected the man sitting across the room. He stood when she entered, not out of deference she could tell, but out of habit. Tall, dark-suited, with eyes the color of a winter sea that fixed on her for exactly 1 second before sliding away. As if he'd already seen everything he needed to see. As if she were a variable he'd already calculated. She hated that immediately. Ilara. Her grandfather's voice came from behind the mahogany desk, measured as always, carrying the particular weight of a man who had never once in 78 years been told no. Sit down. She sat. The stranger remained standing near the window, hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the gray London skyline as though the conversation had nothing to do with him. "This is Nathaniel Cole," Edward said. "You may know the name." She did. Cole Industries. Clean energy, aerospace contracts, a private portfolio that made most old money families look modest. She knew the name the way you know the name of a chess piece. By function, not by face. "Mr. Cole." She nodded once. He turned then, and she registered the details in the involuntary way the brain catalogs threats. Jaw too sharp, expression too still, and something behind those gray-green eyes that she couldn't immediately classify. Not coldness. Something more deliberate than that. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was low and even, and it landed somewhere in her chest in a way she chose immediately and firmly to ignore. "I'll be direct," Edward said, which was the only way he ever said anything. He opened a folder on his desk and slid it across the surface toward her. "You will marry Nathaniel. The engagement will be announced within the week. The wedding will take place in 30 days. The room did something strange then. It seemed to tighten as though the walls had moved an inch closer without making a sound. Ilara looked at the folder, then at her grandfather, then, despite herself, at the man by the window. He was still watching her. That same expression, patient, unreadable, like someone waiting to see which way a coin would land. "And if I refuse?" she asked, because she always asked, because she had never in 26 years simply accepted. "Then you leave this house tonight," Edward said without pause, without flinching. "The trust, the shares, your position at Whitmore Group, dissolved. You'll have what's in your personal account and the clothes in your wardrobe. Nothing more." She heard her mother's breath catch somewhere behind her. Caroline had been in the room this whole time, she realized, sitting in the far chair like a piece of furniture that had learned not to speak. Ilara did not look at her mother. She had learned a long time ago that looking at her mother in moments like this only made things worse. She looked at Nathaniel Cole instead. "What do you get out of this?" she asked him directly, cutting past the negotiation entirely. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. "A business arrangement," he said, "one that benefits both families." "That's not what I asked." The almost smile held for a moment. Then it disappeared, and what replaced it was something quieter, harder to name. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He didn't elaborate. He just held her gaze, steady and unhurried, and said nothing more, and somehow that was worse than any answer he could have given. She picked up the folder. The contract was 12 pages. She read every line, not because she expected to find an exit, but because Ilara Whitmore did not sign anything she hadn't read, not even under duress. On page 7, she found a clause that made her stop. She read it twice. Then she closed the folder and set it on the desk with controlled precision. "I need 48 hours, she said. "You have until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning," Edward replied. She stood. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door, and she did not let a single thing she was feeling reach her face until she was in the hallway with the door shut behind her. And even then, she only allowed herself 3 seconds of standing completely still with her eyes closed before she started moving again. Behind the closed door, she heard nothing. Not her grandfather's voice, not her mother's, and not his. Just silence, which was somehow the loudest thing in the room. She called Maggie from the car. "He's arranged a marriage," Ilara said, before her best friend could finish saying hello. "My grandfather, an actual contractual signed and delivered arranged marriage, in the 21st century, in London." There was a pause on the other end. Then, "Okay, I'm going to need you to start from the beginning, and I'm going to need you to speak slowly, because I just got home from a 12-hour shift and my brain is running at about 40%. Ilara told her. All of it. The study, the folder, the 12-page contract, the clause on page 7 that she still hadn't fully processed, and the man by the window who had looked at her like she was something he'd already decided about. "What's the clause?" Maggie asked. "It says that if either party terminates the marriage within 2 years without mutual written consent, they forfeit all claims to their respective family assets. Both parties. Not just me. Him too." Silence.
Understood.
"So he has skin in the
What's
game,"
status?
Maggie said slowly.
He's
"Significant
alone,
skin.
but cautious.
Which means he agreed to this knowing he could lose as much as you could."
I have it under
Yes.
control.
Another pause.
What?
"Ilara,
Are you
why would a man
serious
worth that
right
much agree to
now?
that?"
Yes,
She didn't have an
it's
answer.
true. I just
That was the
found
part
out.
that had been sitting in her chest
Oh
since
my
she left the
God,
house,
this is
occupying the space where panic would normally
unbelievable.
be,
What do we
pushing it
do?
aside.
We need to talk
Not the ultimatum.
in person.
She
Okay,
had
I'm
half
on my
expected
way.
some version of that from Edward eventually. But him. The fact that Nathaniel Cole, who needed nothing from the Whitmore family, had sat in that room and agreed to terms that put his own assets at risk. She had done research in the car. 40 minutes of it, while the driver took the long route home because she'd asked him to. Cole Industries was solid, not dependent on Whitmore Group, not struggling, not in any position that would require a strategic marriage alliance. His quarterly numbers were better than theirs. So why? She showed up at 9 the next morning. She wasn't sure exactly when she'd made the decision. Somewhere around 3 a.m., sitting cross-legged on her bed with the contract open in front of her and Maggie asleep on her sofa. She had stopped thinking about what she was losing and started thinking about that clause, about what it meant that he had agreed to it, about the fact that the man had looked at her in that room and said nothing, not a reassurance, not a pitch, not a single word designed to make her comply, and had seemed entirely unbothered by the silence. She had met a lot of men who wanted things from her family. They all talked too much. Edward was already at his desk when she walked in. Nathaniel was there too, standing in the same position as the day before, and she had the irrational thought that he might have simply stayed there overnight, waiting.
Edward,
"I have conditions,"
this is
she said,
the
without sitting
only
down.
path forward.
Her grandfather's eyes narrowed
Ilara,
slightly.
you can't
Nathaniel
be
turned from the
serious.
window.
The risks are too
3 of them,
high.
she continued.
I've considered
First,
everything.
Separate bedrooms.
We
Second,
move now.
I
This
continue
is
my role at
reckless.
Whitmore Group without interference from either of you regarding my
Nathaniel,
decisions.
if we proceed, there are
She
conditions.
paused. I want a private
Full
conversation with Mr. Cole
transparency,
before I
no
sign anything.
secrets.
Alone.
And I lead
Edward
the
looked at
strategy.
Nathaniel.
Are we
Something
clear?
passed between them. Quick, unreadable. Agreed, Edward said. He left the room. And for the first time, she was alone with Nathaniel Cole, with 12 pages of contract on the desk between them and the London grey pressing in through the windows. "You didn't try to convince me," she said. "No. Why not?" He was quiet for a moment in that way of his that she was already recognizing. Not evasion, but actual consideration, as if he took the question seriously enough to think before answering. "Because you don't want to be convinced," he said. "You want to decide." She looked at him. He looked back. The contract sat between them, unsigned, and the air in the room had a particular quality to it. Taut, charged, like the moment before a storm commits to being a storm. "If this goes wrong," she said, "we both lose." "Yes. That doesn't concern you?" "It motivates me," he said, "to make sure it doesn't go wrong." She picked up the pen. She signed on the designated line, her handwriting precise and unhesitating, and she slid it across the desk. He signed without reading it again. He'd already read it. Of course he had. When he looked up, she was already turning toward the door. "Miss Whitmore." She stopped. "I don't want your money," he said. "I want you to know that." She turned just enough to see him in her periphery, that still face, those unquiet eyes. "Then what do you want?" she asked, the same question she'd asked yesterday, the one he hadn't answered. This time he said, "Time." She left without responding. But in the elevator, alone, she pressed her back against the wall and stared at the ceiling, and thought about that word for the entire ride down. Time. Not a merger. Not a legacy. Not shares or assets or strategic positioning. Time. She was still thinking about it when the doors opened. The wedding was 31 days later. It was, objectively, beautiful. The kind of beautiful that required 6 weeks of planning compressed into 4, a florist who charged per stem, and a venue that had hosted 2 royal events and a prime minister's daughter. White roses everywhere, Edward's choice, not hers, and candlelight that turned everything warm and golden and deceptively tender. Ilara stood at the altar in a dress she had chosen herself, ivory silk that skimmed the floor, hair pinned up with a single strand falling loose along her jaw. She had not cried getting dressed. She had not shaken. She had treated it with the same composure she gave boardroom presentations, and she was rather proud of that. She was less proud of what happened when Nathaniel lifted the veil. He did it slowly, both hands careful, the way you handle something you don't want to damage. And when the fabric cleared her face, his eyes found hers immediately. And whatever she'd prepared herself to feel in that moment, it wasn't this. Wasn't the heat that moved up the back of her neck. Wasn't the way her breath rearranged itself in her chest. He looked at her like she was the only fixed point in the room. The officiant said the words. They repeated them.
Ilara,
His voice was steady.
We need
Hers
to
was steadier
discuss
because she had
this.
practiced being steady her
There's
entire
nothing
life.
to discuss.
And
I'm
then the
done.
officiant said, "You may now kiss the
Please,
bride."
Don't go
And she
like
thought,
this.
This is the performance. This is the
Goodbye,
moment they act for the
Nathaniel.
room. This is contractual and formal and means exactly nothing. His hand came to her waist. Firm, deliberate, not possessive. Something more complicated than that. Something that said, "I'm not going anywhere," in a language that had nothing to do with words. The kiss was supposed to be brief. It was not brief. It wasn't theatrical either. No dip,
Nathaniel,
no dramatics
if
for the
we
crowd.
proceed, there are
Just his mouth on hers,
conditions.
and the
Full
impossible warmth of it,
transparency, no
and the way time did
secrets.
something strange and
And I
non-linear
lead the
for approximately
strategy.
4 seconds.
Are we clear?
She felt his hand press slightly at her waist, as if he'd lost the thread of the performance for a moment, as if it had become something else. When they separated, she looked straight ahead. He looked straight ahead. The room applauded. They did not look at each other for the rest of the ceremony. At the reception, she moved through the crowd with practiced grace, smiling at people she barely knew, accepting congratulations that felt like they belonged to a different woman. Nathaniel stayed near, not hovering, maintaining exactly the right distance, close enough to be convincing, far enough to give her room. She noticed that he tracked her through the crowd without appearing to. She noticed that twice when someone cornered her in conversation she clearly didn't want, he appeared beside her within 30 seconds. She didn't ask him how he knew. She wasn't ready to examine what it meant that he did. At 11, they took a car to the airport. The flight to the Maldives was 7 hours. They sat across the aisle from each other, her choice, and she slept for 4 of them, and when she woke, she found a blanket had been placed over her that hadn't been there before. She looked across the aisle. Nathaniel was reading or pretending to, his face turned toward the window. She did not say thank you, but she folded the blanket carefully when she was done with it, instead of leaving it in a heap, and she thought that probably said the same thing in a language neither of them had to negotiate. The hotel was obscene in the best possible way. Glass floors over turquoise water, a private pool, 2 bedrooms as per the agreement, a terrace wide enough to get genuinely lost on. She stood at the edge of it that first afternoon, watching the ocean do its slow, indifferent thing, and allowed herself 30 seconds of feeling completely overwhelmed before she folded that away too. That evening, there was dinner. The hotel had set the table on the terrace, Candles, white linen, the kind of meal that made you understand why people paid for things like this. She wore the silk dress. He wore linen, no tie, and she had the disorienting experience of seeing him look less like a boardroom and more like a person. They talked. That was the thing she hadn't anticipated. How easily they talked, once the architecture of the situation stopped demanding that they perform at each other. He asked her about Whitmore Group, not in the deferential way people usually asked, but with actual questions, the kind that required her to think. She asked him about coal industries, and he answered without the usual deflection men gave when they thought a woman was asking to be polite. The wine was good. The candles were lower. The space between them across the table had somehow, without either of them moving, gotten smaller. The clause on page 7, she said at some point in the second glass. My grandfather put it in. I know. He told you.
Love you too.
I asked for it. She set down her glass. You asked for the clause that puts your assets at risk. Yes. Why? He turned his wine glass slowly on the tablecloth, considering. Because I didn't want you to feel like the only one with something to lose, he said. I wanted the playing field level. She stared at him. He met her gaze with that infuriating patience of his, that complete willingness to let silence exist. That is,
Laura, you
she said
look
carefully,
absolutely radiant
either the most calculated
tonight.
thing I've ever heard,
Thank you so
or the
much.
most
That means
unexpectedly
a lot.
decent. Can't it be both?
Congratulations
Despite herself, she laughed.
on a wonderful
It came out before
event,
she could
Laura.
calibrate it. Short,
Thank you. I'm
real,
so
surprised
glad
out
you
of her.
could come.
His expression shifted when she did it, something opening in his face that he didn't quite control, and she filed that away. He wasn't as unreadable as she'd thought. He'd just been careful. Why did you agree to this? She asked. The real question, the one she'd been carrying for 32 days. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might
Boa
deflect again.
noite.
Then he said,
Estávamos conversando.
Your grandfather came to me 8
Perdão,
months ago.
não pude
He
deixar
showed me
de
a file.
notar.
É uma
He paused.
conversa particular.
It had
Natália.
information in it about a situation
Claro.
3 years ago.
Mas eu insisto
You were being
em me
harassed by a
juntar.
business
Eu
partner, a
preferiria
man named
que
Reeves.
não.
Her whole
Vamos
body
ver.
went very still. You handled it yourself, Nathaniel continued, voice even, careful. Quietly, completely. Most people wouldn't have known how. I watched how you did it. He looked at her directly. I'd been watching you work for 2 years before your grandfather walked into my office. The candle between them flickered. The ocean made its sound. Ilara's heart was doing something complicated and inconvenient behind her ribs. You agreed to marry a stranger, she said slowly, because you'd been watching me handle a crisis 3 years ago. I agreed, he said, because your grandfather gave me a reason to do something I'd already been trying to find a reason to do. The words landed quietly. She turned them over. She looked at the man across the table. Linen shirt, glass of wine, the most patient eyes she'd ever been forced to sit with. And she felt the very careful structure she'd built around this situation begin, in one small and significant place, to crack. She didn't let it show. But she stopped trying to figure out his angle, because she was becoming increasingly, inconveniently certain that he didn't have one. Time, she said. He looked at her. That's what you said you wanted, she said. In my grandfather's study, time. Yes, time for what? His gaze was steady and very quiet and honest in a way that cost him something. For you to see me, he said, not coal industries, not a contract, me. The terrace was very still. She became aware suddenly of how close they were. When had that happened? The lean across the table, the narrowing of that careful distance she'd maintained for 32 days. And she was aware of his hand near hers on the white linen, and of the particular quality of the air between them, which was no longer anything like neutral. She did not pull back, neither did he. And the night that followed, the conversation that stretched past midnight, the moment on the terrace when the space between them closed completely, when she stopped thinking about contracts and started thinking only about this, about him, about the way his hands were careful and certain all at once. That night did not feel like obligation. It felt like the first decision she had made fully and completely for herself. She found out on a Tuesday. It wasn't dramatic, the way she'd always imagined life-altering discoveries would be. There was no thunderclap. Just a Tuesday, gray and ordinary, and Dr. Hayes sitting across from her in the Whitmore family clinic with his hands folded and his expression professionally gentle in the way that meant the news wasn't bad exactly, but it was large. 6 weeks, he said. She drove home in silence. She sat in the kitchen, not her grandfather's
It's
kitchen,
so
the house she and
peaceful
Nathaniel had
here,
moved into 2
away
weeks after
from
returning from the
everything.
Maldives, a converted
It
Georgian
is.
terrace in Notting
No
Hill that they'd chosen
deadlines,
together,
no
which was
calls.
strange to remember now.
Just
That they'd
us.
stood in an empty house and
feels
pointed at
more
rooms
real.
and disagreed about the kitchen tiles in a way that
Exactly,
had
this
felt
is
almost
the
normal.
version I prefer.
And she sat with the test on the table in front of her and she tried to identify what
To us,
she was feeling.
and this beautiful
Fear was the
evening.
loudest thing. That was
It's
honest.
perfect.
Fear that this changed the geometry of everything.
You
the
look
contract,
absolutely
the 2-year
stunning
clause,
tonight.
the delicate and unnamed thing between
I feel
them that had been
so
growing
lucky
quietly
to be
since the
here
Maldives,
with you.
since the terrace, since she'd started noticing the
can
way he
do
put coffee on
this.
before she was awake and never mentioned it, since she'd caught herself
Oh,
looking for him
wow,
in rooms
this is
before she registered that she was
incredible.
doing it. She was terrified that a baby would make him stay for the wrong reasons. She was equally terrified that it wouldn't change anything for him at all. She was still sitting there when she heard his key in the door. He came into the kitchen, loosening his tie, and he saw her immediately. Saw the set of her shoulders, the thing on the table that she hadn't moved. And he went still in the doorway. She watched him process it. It took him 3 seconds. He crossed the room, pulled out the chair across from her and sat down.
Being
Talk
here
to me,
with you,
he said.
looking at this
It's 6 weeks,
sunset
she said. Her
makes
voice
me
came out steadier than
realize
she
how
expected.
much these
He looked at the
moments
test,
mean.
then at her. She waited for
I
the
feel
calculation,
so
the mental
lucky to
arithmetic of
share
what this
this
meant
with
for the
you.
contract,
It's
for the
beautiful,
assets,
Nathaniel.
for the strategic arrangement that had started
Laura,
all of this.
there's something
Instead, he
important
said,
to share.
"Are you okay?"
I'm
"I don't know
listening.
yet." He nodded,
This
slowly,
decision
as if
will
that was a
affect us
completely
both
acceptable answer.
deeply.
Then something happened to his expression,
I understand
a
the
gradual
weight of
quiet
that.
shift, like light changing in a room when the clouds move.
This view
His
is
shoulders
incredible,
His jaw
but it's
unclenched,
nothing compared
and she
to
watched,
you.
with
You
her heart doing
always
that
know what to
inconvenient,
say to
complicated
make me
thing,
smile.
as Nathaniel Cole stopped being
I mean
careful and let her
every
see
word.
something unguarded on his face for the first time.
I'm so glad
He
we're
looked,
here.
she realized, happy,
Me too.
not strategically, not performatively, just genuinely, cleanly happy in the way of someone who has received news they hadn't let themselves want too much. "Nate," she said, and the shortening of his name felt significant, though she'd been doing it for 2 weeks without noticing. "This complicates the contract. I don't care about the contract. You should. You have assets at Ilara." His voice was gentle but definite. "I don't care about the contract." She looked at him. He looked at her. The test sat between them on the kitchen table, and outside the window London continued its gray Tuesday, entirely indifferent to the fact that something was shifting, quietly and permanently, inside this room. "You're not doing the math," she said. "I did the math 2 months ago," he said. "On the terrace, I'm done doing math." She felt something release in her chest. Not dramatically. Just a slow, careful unclenching, like a fist that had been holding on to something for so long it had forgotten how to open. She told Maggie that afternoon on the phone, while Nathaniel made dinner in the kitchen, and the smell of something warm moved through the house. "So let me understand," Maggie said. "You were forced into a marriage by your terrifying grandfather. You've somehow fallen for your contractual husband, and now you're having his baby." "Yes. And you're not spiraling." "I'm not spiraling." A pause. "Who are you, and what have you done with Ilara Whitmore?" She laughed. In the kitchen, she heard Nathaniel's voice ask if she wanted the wine opened, and she called back yes, and the ordinary ease of it, the complete, impossible normalcy of that small exchange, settled something in her she hadn't known was unsettled. But there was still Edward. She had not spoken to her grandfather since the wedding. He had not called. He had sent via his assistant a single card of congratulations, which had arrived 3 days after the ceremony in his handwriting, precise, vertical, old-fashioned, and which she had placed in the kitchen drawer without fully deciding what she felt about it. She decided the next morning. "I need to see my grandfather," she told Nathaniel over coffee. He looked up from his phone. "Do you want company?" She considered it. "No," she said, "but I want you to be here when I get back." Something in his face settled into quiet certainty. "I'll be here," he said. She drove to the Whitmore house alone. Edward was in the garden, unusual for him. He preferred interiors, controlled environments, sitting in a chair near the far wall where the rose bushes were, thinner than she remembered, though it had only been weeks. The garden looked like him, rigorous, immaculate, not a thing out of place. She sat in the chair across from him. A tea set was already there. "You knew," she said. No preamble, it was a family trait. He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "That you would come to me? That he would be right for me?" She held his gaze. "You didn't do this for the company. The company didn't need a coal alliance. You did this for me." His expression didn't change, but his grip on the teacup, she noticed, shifted slightly. "You were making yourself smaller," he said finally, in the tone of a man delivering a verdict he'd considered for a long time. "You were taking up exactly as much space as the room allowed and calling it ambition. I've watched you do it for 10 years. He set down his cup. "You needed someone who wouldn't let you disappear. So you sold me," she said. Not quite anger, something more complicated. "I gave you leverage," he said, "and called it an ultimatum so that you'd fight. If I'd asked you to meet him, you'd have been polite. You'd have shaken his hand and found 3 reasonable objections and gone back to your quiet life." His blue eyes were very steady. "I needed you angry. Angry. You're impossible to ignore." She looked at this old man in his garden, with his rigid spine and his cold methods and his impossible love that operated entirely through manipulation, and she felt complicated things. A lifetime of complicated things arriving all at once. "I'm pregnant," she said. The garden was very quiet. A bird somewhere, the sound of distant traffic. Something crossed Edward Whitmore's face, swift, almost hidden, the closest thing to unguarded she had ever seen on him. It was not surprise. It was relief. She understood then, fully, what Nathaniel had known before she did. That page 7, the clause, the whole elaborate construction of this. It had never been about assets. It had been about tying 2 people to each other long enough for them to stop being afraid. She picked up her tea. "You're going to be a terrible great-grandfather," she said. His chin lifted. "I'll be exactly the kind of great-grandfather the child needs." She almost smiled. God help us all. The morning Alara signed the dissolution papers was a Wednesday. Not dissolution of the marriage. Dissolution of the contract, the original 12 pages, the 2-year clause, every numbered provision that had started all of this. Nathaniel had had his lawyers prepare them quietly without telling her, and he set them on the kitchen table beside her coffee, with the same deliberate calm with which he did everything. She looked at the papers, then at him. "You're tearing up the contract," she said. "We are," he said, "if you want." She picked up the first page. She read it. She always read everything that hadn't changed. And at the bottom, beneath the standard dissolution language, there was a handwritten line in his narrow, precise script. "Whatever comes next is our choice. Not an agreement. A choice." She set the page down. Outside the window, the November light was doing something soft and generous over the Notting Hill rooftops, the kind of light that London occasionally produced without warning, as if remembering it was capable of warmth. "You know this voids the asset protections," she said. "Yes. Both yours and mine." "Yes." She looked at him. He was leaning against the kitchen counter with his coffee, dressed for the office. Gray suit, white shirt, the black watch, and he was watching her the way he had watched her in that study 7 months ago, when she was someone who thought she had him figured out. patient, certain, like a man who had already made his peace with every possible outcome. She thought about 7 months. She thought about a terrace over the ocean and a blanket on a plane and a Tuesday with a test on a kitchen table. She thought about the way he had learned, without being asked, that she needed 15 minutes alone in the morning before she could form full sentences, and had simply started leaving coffee on her side of the kitchen and taking his to his office. She thought about the argument they'd had about the kitchen tiles, which she had won, and the argument they'd had about her working through the weekend, which he had won, and the way that being wrong sometimes felt different with him, like information rather than defeat. She thought about the baby, 12 weeks now, which they had told no one except Maggie and her grandfather and Dr. Hayes, and which had changed the shape of the house somehow, the way a future can change a space before it arrives. She picked up the pen. She signed. She slid the papers across the counter and he signed too, and then there was a moment in which they were just two people in a kitchen on a Wednesday morning. No contract between them. Nothing binding them to anything except the 7 months of ordinary and extraordinary life they'd built inside the architecture of an arrangement that had long since stopped being one. "Nathaniel," she said. He looked at her. She had spent 7 months being careful with words. She who had never been careful about anything except the things that mattered most. She found, standing in this kitchen with the November light coming through the window and the dissolution papers signed on the counter, that she was done being careful about this one. "I'm in love with you," she said. "I want that to be clear and on the record, since we just burned the only actual record we had." He put down his coffee. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, and his hands came to her face, both of them, careful and certain all at once, exactly the way he'd lifted her veil. And he looked at her for a moment in which she felt completely, undefensively seen. "I have been," he said, "since before I had any right to be." He kissed her. Not like the altar, though that had not been nothing, and they both knew it. This was different. This was chosen, entirely by both of them, in a kitchen in Notting Hill on a gray Wednesday with coffee going cold on the counter. And it was the best kiss she'd ever had, because it was the first one that belonged only to them. When they separated, she pressed her forehead against his chin, and he kept his hands where they were, and neither of them moved for a long moment. "Your grandfather is going to be insufferable about this," he said. "He already is," she said. "He called this morning to ask if we'd discussed nursery colors." She felt his chest move. That rare thing, his actual laugh, the one he didn't ration. "What did you say?" "I told him he wasn't allowed to have opinions about the nursery until he apologized for the mahogany desk speech." "Did he apologize?" "He said, and I quote, 'I never apologize for results.'" Nathaniel's arms settled around her properly then, warm and solid and completely without agenda. "He's not wrong," he said quietly. She thought about it. Her grandfather in his garden, with his rigid love and his impossible methods, who had looked at his granddaughter making herself small and had decided, in the only way he knew how, to make the world larger for her. Who had found a man who had already been watching her and had given them both a reason to stop pretending they didn't want what they wanted. Who had put a clause on page 7 not to protect assets, but to make sure the playing field was equal. That she would never feel like the only one at risk. Terrible methods. True intention. Families were complicated like that. "He's not wrong," she agreed. She pulled back enough to look at Nathaniel. The jaw she'd catalogued as a threat 7 months ago, the eyes she'd spent considerable effort not getting lost in, the face she now knew in all its unguarded versions, the quiet one over morning coffee, the focused one in a meeting, the rare uncontrolled one the morning she told him about the baby. "We should call him," she said. "Tell him about the contract dissolution. He'll consider it a personal victory. He'll be right." She watched his face. "Does that bother you?" He considered it seriously in the way she loved. Had loved, she realized, for quite some time, the way he gave questions their actual weight. "No," he said. "He bet on us. We won. I think he gets to feel good about that. She nodded slowly. I'm calling Maggie first, she said, in terms of hierarchy of people who get good news. Obviously. She picked up her phone. Then she set it down again. Nate. He raised an eyebrow. Thank you, she said, for asking for the clause. He held her gaze. Thank you, he said, for reading to page 7. She called Maggie. Maggie screamed for approximately 25 seconds straight, then composed herself enough to say, I want to be godmother. I want this on record. I said it first. Nathaniel could hear it from across the kitchen, and she watched his expression do the quiet, warm thing she had stopped trying to file away and started simply allowing. She called Edward in the afternoon from the garden, their garden now small and north-facing and nothing like the Whitmore house, with its overgrown lavender and its broken gate latch that Nathaniel kept meaning to fix and hadn't, which she had decided she liked, the small imperfection of it, the realness. We dissolved the contract, she told him. Silence on the line. Then, about time. You're not surprised. I'm never surprised, Edward said, which was almost certainly true. I assume Nathaniel's retaining his assets? We both are. It's not relevant anymore. Another silence, different from the first. No, he said, more quietly. I suppose it isn't. She let the silence sit, which was something she had learned, from Nathaniel, if she was honest, that silence didn't always need filling. Sometimes it was just the space where things settled. Grandpa, she said, and she hadn't used that word since she was 9 years old. She heard him go very still on the other end of the line. I forgive you, for the mahogany desk, for the ultimatum, for all of it. She paused. But if you meddle in my marriage again, I will personally restructure Whitmore Group's entire board and replace your portrait in the lobby with a fern. A long pause. Then, so quietly she almost missed it. Understood. And then, even more quietly, thank you, Ilara. She hung up. She stood in the garden with the lavender moving slightly in the November wind, and she let herself feel all of it. The terror of the beginning, the slow unmaking of her defenses, the Tuesday with the test, the Wednesday with the contract, the man in the kitchen who had asked for nothing except time and had meant every word of it. She had walked into her grandfather's study in a cream blazer, armored and expecting a battle, and had come out the other side with a life she hadn't known to want. Not a smaller life, not a managed one, a full one. Inconvenient and real and entirely, finally hers. Inside the house, she could hear Nathaniel on a call, his voice low and calm, the ordinary sound of an ordinary Wednesday in a life that was theirs. She stood in the cold garden a moment longer, her hand resting against the slight curve of her abdomen, and she smiled, not for anyone, not for a room full of people at a wedding that had felt like someone else's, but for herself, in a garden with a broken gate that nobody had fixed yet and lavender that grew however it wanted. Then she went inside. The gate could wait. Everything she needed was already there.